Hey everybody, my name is Jenny Jamball, and I am here today with the man who I feel needs no introduction at all, but David Leaf, the talented David Leaf. So before we get into our interview today, I just want to thank the team over at the Beach Boys subreddit and also production company Nameless Vision. They are the ones who have made this conversation possible today. So a big thank you to them. And also noting that there will be an AMA with David coming up on Reddit soon. I don't know when, but watch this space. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask, just make a note of them, and that will be happening really soon. I'm sure David can't wait to answer all of your questions. So I'm sure you're all aware about David and his achievements, but if you aren't, let me just give you a very quick overview of some things that may be relevant to our conversation today. So, first of all, he was part of the documentary Beautiful Dreamer, which was a beautiful insight into Brian's life during the time of Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So if you have not seen that, please, 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 please watch it. It is absolutely amazing. A beautiful document of Brian. Um,
Thank you.
David, you're welcome. And David has also authored some Beach Boys books. We've got Beach Boys and the California Myth, another incredible piece there, which has recently had an update. And the reason we are here today, his newest book, which we can see behind David there, thank you. We've got Smile, the rise, the fall, and the resurrection of Brian Wilson. So thank you, David. Really appreciate you being here today. That's a lot of talking from me, so I may jump into my first question here and, open the floor to you. And I guess my first question would be in regard to the title, I suppose, because it is the first time I heard about the title of the book, it really grabbed me, and I was like, I couldn't picture a better way to describe Smile from where it was and what it became. So I just wanted to hear some reflections on you about the thought process behind this title and what message you were trying to convey with that.
Uh, First, hi, Jenny. And second, it's the first time I've been asked that question.
Wonderful.
So well done right off the bat. Um, I actually wanted to call the book A Genius Revealed, the story of Brian Wilson and Smile. And the publisher said, no, we want the word smile in the title for all the algorithms that exist on the internet. And so the subtitle, I wanted it to be something that would reflect on the journey that Brian went, the personal triumph that was Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So it seemed like the rise, fall, and resurrection of Brian Wilson uh, fit fit that story well.
Can completely resonate with that. And I really like that you brought up the word genius because that was something I noticed whilst reading the book. And I've been very fortunate to have early access to that. And the language used throughout the book is so powerful. And just for some examples, just, for obviously not many of us have read the book yet, but, the words used are like things like captivating, terrifying, honest, unbelievable, vulnerable, and the main word that we see a lot is genius. And I did a little bit of search, and the word genius is used nearly 50 times throughout the book, which is 43 if we're going to be exact, which is such a testament to Brian and his work. But that also leads me to think, what is the weight of that word on Brian? I know for me, I would find that so intimidating. And I just wonder what you would reflect on that, especially considering, we know that Brian has felt some guilt in the past about feeling like, why is there all this attention on me as a beach boy? And then there's big words, particularly in relation to Smile. So what do you think the implications are on the word genius on Brian?
Well, now you're two for two, Jenny, with questions that no one's asked. So this is going to be a great conversation. The there was an interview in the mid '60s with Brian where he said, "I'm not a genius, I'm ingenious." You'll note that the book begins with a quote from Albert Einstein, who was indisputably a genius. And when Van Dyke Parks was a young boy and was at, was living in Princeton going to school, he actually had the opportunity to be in Einstein's presence. So Van Dyke said, I've been in the presence of genius. I know what that is. So he would not use that word for Brian. He would talk about brilliant and incredible and wonderful, and all those other adjectives. But genius is, you know, it's credited to Derek Taylor in terms of the public eye as to when that word began to describe Brian. But if you listen to the most horrible tape in Beach Boys history, the Help Me Murray tape,
Hmm.
you hear his father say, "I'm a genius too." So clearly, a year before Derek Taylor and the British press was calling Brian a genius, the word was floating around. I think it's been a terrible burden
I
on
agree.
Brian. He did not want to be seen as a genius. He really sees himself as a regular person. Everybody who knows him and all his friends through the years know that he just loves to hang out and have fun and make people laugh and have something to eat. And being a genius is not part of that. He just wants to be, as Jeffrey Foskett says in the book, Brian Douglas Wilson. But that was not his fate. His fate was to create music that was so out of the ordinary for what popular music was in 66 in particular, that the only word that fit was genius. Now, when Sir when the late Sir George Martin says, if I have to select one living genius, it would be popular music, it would be Brian Wilson. And when Sir Elton John says that Brian Wilson is, the only genius, in popular music, uh, who are we to argue?
That's absolutely right. I mean, they're the experts, but I do reflect on how, like you said, how much of a burden that would be. And, thinking about just words and the weight of them and the burden that they hold, that also leads me to think about criticism as well. And how important do you think criticism was for Brian on this project, and how whether that hindered its success, contributed to its success, or just didn't really make a difference? I'm of the mind that criticism does play a part, and sometimes we can't really reach the places we need to reach without that because it's kind of a push. But knowing how, fragile Brian can be at times, and we all are as humans, how that impacted him and his work, especially picking up something so many years later, knowing that there were many critics out there.
Well, before I answer that, let me step back to the previous question. In 1966, Brian was interviewed in a UK rock magazine, and he said something like, "Our next album is going to be as different from Pet Sounds as Pet Sounds was from Summer Days and Summer Nights." This was not somebody who shrunk from a challenge. He was well aware of what he was saying, and he was saying it with complete confidence. Now, talk about setting the bar high. This guy, whether you called him a genius or ingenious, he knew he was making incredible music, and he knew there was incredible music ahead of him when he said that. Now, in terms of criticism, are we talking about in 66, 67, or are we talking about it in 2003, 2004?
Say you could reflect on both, because you needed the stuff in 66 and 67 to happen to get to where he was in 2003. But I guess to really focus on the current, I don't know if many people were really being critical at that time, because Smile had been built up to be such an enigma that everyone was just more excited than critical. But I'm just really conscious of how critics do play a part, and not everyone's going to be excited about these types of projects.
Well, the criticism comes from different places. And in Brian's world, in 66, the record company was critical of the direction he was taking the Beach Boys in. His father was critical of the direction he was taking the Beach Boys in. And from everything we've heard, it seems that the Beach Boys weren't exactly enthralled with the direction he was taking the group in. So with Pet Sounds, he was able to shrug it off. except when it didn't sell as well as he anticipated. There weren't that many critics in America in '66, and it got, I think Richard Goldstein in New York gave it a rave review. There weren't that many places to really write significant, substantial uh, reviews. The criticism came from Capitol Records. Um, in a sense, it was the product manager said, "Hey, Brian, can't you give us some more stuff that sounds like California Girls?" And the answer was no. And so rather than criticize him when he said that, they sabotaged him. So they shipped Best of the Beach Boys when record stores were reordering Pet Sounds, making it impossible for Pet Sounds to sell, millions of copies. In England, that didn't happen. He got rave reviews for Pet Sounds in England. And that began to create the legend of what he was working on next. First Good Vibrations and then Smile. Um, Again, the record company is a very funny quote from Brian, where he says the record company came to me and says, "We'd like some more commercial records." And he was like, "See you later." You know, that's not what I'm doing. And, the critics in his world were silenced with Good Vibrations because it was a million selling #1 single. But the Smile music in his inner circle, not including the Beach Boys, because the Beach Boys were touring, but his inner circle was raving about this music, raving in a good way. And so there wasn't criticism. What there was when the Beach Boys returned was a lack of complete support. That, Brian, we think this is the most brilliant thing we've ever heard. We can't wait to get into the studio and do the vocals. Now, that said, when they recorded their vocals, their singing is magnificent. There's nobody, including Brian's band, who is going to tell you that that the Beach Boys vocals are anything but the best in the world. That their blend is spectacular. It's unique. Now that's the musical instrument he created. Now there was some resentment at being treated as just a musical instrument. Now, whether you call that criticism or just turmoil, it created some of the problems that led to him shelving Smile. And as you've read, I enumerate somewhere near a dozen contributory factors to why he put Smile on the shelf. And everyone has a different opinion on that. And that's something that's important to understand about the Smile story. None of us were there. We're all Johnny come latelys to this, if that translates. Um, the people who were in the studio when Brian was recording the tracks loved what he was doing. They didn't necessarily understand. They'd be called in for a session and it might be, 8 bars and that would be it. But they thought what he was doing was out of this world. There were issues with the Beach Boys. Um, there were issues with drugs. There were issues with the record company. There were issues with how long it would take him to finish the record. In Beautiful Dreamer, which you kindly referred to, he said, I figured I needed a year and nobody would give me a year. Now, we have to remember that as recent, he'd put out 4 albums a year and 3 albums a year and 2 albums a year. And when Pet Sounds was not on time from Capitol's point of view, the Beach Boys went in and did Beach Boys Party. When Pet Sounds was not what Capitol wanted, they put out Best of the Beach Boys. So he was correct. No one was going to give him a year. The record company it wasn't acceptable. So there's lots of reasons. One would have to do a forensic analysis of Brian's brain to know exactly what percentage each of these would contribute. But so he puts it on the shelf. But he comes back to it periodically, and the Beach Boys come back to it right away on Smiley Smile. They're doing wonderful, except it's in this really kind of lo-fi version of it. And then there's taking little pieces of it for Wild Honey in 2020. And then the kind of the piece de resistance is when Surf's Up is the title song of that album. And the story at the time was that it was against Brian's wishes. He did not want it to be included on the album. That said, apparently he went into the studio and tried to record the lead vocal to everybody's satisfaction. And he didn't do it to his satisfaction, so Carl ended up singing the lead. Um, so there's all sorts of bumps in the road along the way. Now, my guess is that from the time he shelved it until the time he presented it to the world on February 20th, 2004, he never did an interview in which he wasn't asked about Smile. Imagine, um, if you would, if you had a child who died in childbirth, and every time your friends talked to you for the next 36 years, they said, "Oh, hey, have you gotten over that? How do you feel about that?" So he wasn't actively thinking about it, except it was being thrown in his face all the time,
Lately, and that
including
was, oh, sorry.
including by me. But my goals were different. My goals were to try to get the music out in a way that worked for in his on his behalf, as opposed to, uh, um, you know, and I don't need an explanation, Brian. We're doing a box set. Here's the
Mm.
track listing. He looks at the track listing and asks me to take one song off, which we do. And then I ask him, Brian, there's this big gap between Good Vibrations, the single, and Heroes and Villains, the single, which was not what he intended the Smile single to be. I said, we need to put something here that will represent that portion of your career. And he said, okay. So that's how Smile music ends up on the Good Vibrations box set. And there's a lot of it. And I thought that would kind of be the end of it, in terms of the Beach Boys. Obviously I was wrong. Um, but in that same era, I tried to. We stood over the table once with a bunch of index cards on which I had written the titles of every Smile fragment, and we tried to sequence it. We failed. Another time, I said to him, I said, Brian, I really would like to get a symphony orchestra to perform this music with a choir because it's just too beautiful to not be heard. And he said, good, I deserve that. I mean, so he knew how great the music was. He just didn't want to be confronted with it all the time. And so when he began touring in 1999, the band found out very quickly not to ask him about it. If they did, it would be, please don't talk about that. That's inappropriate music, or it reminds me of a very dark period of my life. And again, quite by accident, Smile music comes back into our lives, through a Christmas party at Scott Bennett's house in December of 2002, when he and my late wife were sitting on a piano bench with their backs to the piano. And Brian said to Eva, what do you want for Christmas? And she said, for you to play Heroes and Villains. And he said, okay. And he turned around and played it. And,
Oh,
and, and we were just, it was just stunning. And when it was over, I said, Brian, you should do that at the tribute in March. Because we had an all-star tribute to Brian Wilson scheduled for Radio City Music Hall in March 29th of 2001. And he said, okay. And when he played it that night, when Vince Gill, David Crosby, and Jimmy Webb played Surf's Up, when the boys choir sang Our Prayer, he saw how much the audience loved this music, and that kind of broke the ice. And he started adding songs from Smile to his set, and eventually got to Royal Festival Hall. Now, through all that period, all that time when he's reemerging, starting with his first solo album in '88, uh, then in 1995 when he's done the album Orange Crater Art with Van Dyke Parks, which of course brings up questions of Smile every time he does an album promote that album. Um, he does a Don Was documentary and performs a song from Wonderful in that. So all these questions legitimately come up about Smile. And he doesn't necessarily give anybody an answer that's remotely satisfactory. I mean, in Sylvie Simmons, tells the story in her essay in the anthology in the back of the book about, interviewing Brian and him just getting up and leaving the house in the middle of the interview. So this was a subject not so much that critics were criticizing in advance of Brian Wilson Presents Smile, so much as it was the critic in his brain based on what he had heard in late 66 and into 67. Brian, this music isn't right for the Beach Boys. Brian, this music is too advanced for our audience. Brian, what are you doing? This isn't Beach Boys music. And so that had become what he believed. And the moment he performed it at Royal Festival Hall, that all evaporated. Did I
I'm
answer the
glad.
question?
Absolutely, you did, and
Okay.
you've kind of segued very nicely into some of the next question I kind of want to ask is, the emotional impact, because from the very beginning, Smile was filled with emotion. Even the title itself, Brian is saying that, the healing power of laughter. That's why it's called Smile, but it's kind of ironic that it didn't really have a lot of laughter at some points. It was quite harrowing for Brian and possibly other people that were involved. And also, you're highlighting that we will never really know why the project was shelved. Everyone has their reasons, and Brian's never really going to address it. But he does at times give us a little bit of something. And, I kind of just picked out a few things from the book that he had said. First he said he was terrified about performing this naturally in 2004, then
Well,
excited.
let me just interrupt you, Jay.
Of course.
In Beautiful Dreamer, I knew that for that film to succeed, he would have to tell me, meaning the audience,
Mhm.
why he felt Smile.
Absolutely.
And I kept asking him, and one time he said, "David, ask better questions." And then finally he says something like, "If you really want to know from my heart, here are the four reasons." And he says the four reasons. Um, that to me is him explaining why he didn't he put it on the shelf. Now, those four reasons, he says them in sentences, but each one of them could be a chapter in a book.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's so much there. I'm sorry. Now go back to the question you were asking about.
Oh, no, no worries at all. And it's always good to get those insights because you know so much more than I do. So always interrupt because you're going to add value to this conversation when you do so. Um,
I hope so.
Of course. And I think it's kind of interesting because I feel like no matter the reason, it's never enough. People are like, that's not it. We want more, which is such a pressure on anybody, particularly someone that places such, value on their work. And just kind of recognizing that this was such a scary time for Brian to come back in and, put this out for the world to see. And he was so terrified leading up to it. But as you said, once he did it, it evaporated away. Like he said in the book, all my bad thoughts disappeared. Like that's so powerful. He felt at peace. He felt proud, emotional, creative, and thankful. I think that is the takeaway for me, that he felt so thankful for that experience. So I guess my question from this is, do you think Brian needed this? That he needed this experience for himself to be able to go out there and feel the weight of this album?
We wanted it for him, and we never thought it was going to happen in a live situation. So that was the kind of one of the biggest surprises. It made it possible, as Darian Sahanaja says, for him to approach the music not as finishing an album, figuring out how to perform the music live and what sequence that would make sense, which was a kind of a sneaky way of finishing the album. But he definitely needed this. This would be this was from the point of view of fanatics like me and Ray Lawler and Debbie and Eva, who had lived with this in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, always hoping, believing, and dreaming that if he ever finished Smile, it would free him to create um, new great music. So one of the joys was he followed with a brand new piece, That Lucky Old Sun, and then the Gershwin album, which is one of my favorites of his solo career. To give you an idea of how much finishing meant to him, first of all, when we left the Royal Festival Hall on opening night, after all the hubbub and the autograph signing and handshaking and hugging and tears, and we're riding down in the elevator to get into the car to go back to the hotel, he looked at me and he said, "Our smile dream, it came true." And one of the things that's so expansive about that sentence is he says, "Our smile dream, not my smile dream." So there's an inclusiveness to him that's very special. Um, Now, I stayed in London for the entire run at the Royal Festival Hall, and then me and my team came back to Los Angeles to begin work on the movie. And when he got back from the tour, because he continued to tour in England and I think Ireland and some on the continent, he called me the day he got back. He says, "David, you have to come over tomorrow and do an interview." Now, I would guess in Brian's entire career, post 1967 and the shelving of Smile, there was never a time where he said, "I've got to do an interview." Not once nor ever. He did not like being interviewed.
Yeah.
His interviews could be terrible. They could be worthless. Um, when I tried to interview him before London, the video we got from that was of no value. The fact that he called me says, "You have to come over and do an interview." And he was the happiest I'd ever seen him. He was just so happy playing with his two oldest he and Melinda's two oldest adopted daughters, Daria and Delaney, were in the room. He was playing music for them. They were dancing around. He there was no question he wouldn't or couldn't answer. When I asked him to compare Pet Sounds and Smile, he said, "Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give Pet Sounds a 4 and Smile a 10." Now, this is we're talking about Pet Sounds, an album that has typically been at 1 or 2 in the greatest albums of all time polls. So now he's saying that Smile is like so far better than that. That's how he felt about the music at that time, having done Brian Wilson Presents Smile long before the album was released, before it was recorded. In later interviews, he modified it to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give Pet Sounds a 7 and Smile a 10, which I don't I don't know what caused that change of heart, but at any rate, um, he said, here's how he felt about Smile. He said it got better and better and better every night on the tour. And he said, "Believe it or not, David, for the first time in my career, I can't wait to go back out on tour again." He wanted to play Smile for the world, and he did. And so I think that answers your question of what the emotional effect of it was on Brian.
Completely answered that perfectly, and it's so wonderful that he had that experience and that so many people played a part in bringing it to fruition, because he clearly needed it, and that's what I feel. It was like a creative spark, and emotionally was so important to his journey moving forward. So I'm just so thankful that it happened, and just thinking about how
He was
you.
he was terrified.
Oh,
He was
completely
terrified.
upfront.
And
Yeah.
and and there were a number of times prior to going to London where he was asked, "We can cancel this. Let's stop right now." And he said, "No, I have to do it. Have to do it."
I can respect that so much because I think many of us, being human faced with big challenges like that, it's very easy to just say, you know what, too much. I'm going to put that in the too hard basket and I'm never looking at that again. But I think really thinking about Brian and how brave he truly was to conquer his fear and to go out and to give something to us, because how you mentioned the inclusive nature of the album, he recognizes that it is a part of so many people. So I think really sitting with the acknowledgement of the bravery that Brian took to take that step to be out there. And I guess what was that like for you being a part of something so emotionally charged? Because you would have seen so many different sides of Brian during this time. Um, what was that like for you seeing that and helping him through that? Because he definitely sees you as an emotional support. So what was that like for you?
I, it was just another day at the office. I mean, I'm being silly there,
Yeah.
but it was, as a friend, your job, as if you're a real friend, is to support your friend.
Mm.
And so I was supporting my friend as he was trying to do something that we knew how difficult it was. I mean, after all, on the second day of vocal rehearsals, he drives himself to the emergency room. He's so fearful of what's going on. But he got over that. He got over the hump. And so there was always a new fear until London. And the first night in London was as triumphant and as wonderful a moment as I think I'll ever experience in my life.
I can't even imagine. I would have loved to have been there and to experience that, you
Well,
know.
it's one of the reasons, in designing the book the way
Mm.
I did, there's an entire chapter of fan reminiscences of how they felt looking back 20 years later. What did being there that night mean to you? And I think it's one of the most powerful parts of the book because we're all fans. Uh, I've just taken it to the excessive extreme of moving to California and writing books and making films and all of that. But the we'll just call them in Britain they probably call them the average punter. It's these were life-changing moments for a lot of people. These were, I mean, I think I said this once before. You would have wanted to have the Kleenex concession at the Royal Festival Hall that night. Everybody was in tears.
It's remarkable that a piece of work like that can hold so much. And I think my biggest takeaway from this book, apart from having this story out there in print, is just recognizing that you've given a voice to so many people who may have felt like they didn't have a platform to share how they really feel about something that's been so impactful on their lives. And just the cultural impact is wonderful to think about how many people this has touched.
It has touched a lot of people. The album itself sold 800,000 copies. The biggest selling Brian or Beach Boys album um, since Beach Boys Party, I think.
Yeah.
So it was, 40 years later, I mean, that was remarkable just on a business point of view. So it got to a lot of people. The thing that I've come to understand about all of this is that it really more than anything, it was the triumph of the human spirit that Brian um, couldn't have done it on his own. He needed uh, to be surrounded with this velvet glove of these devoted musicians. He needed an audience filled with people who loved him unconditionally and friends surrounding him who loved him unconditionally. It was all of that. So it was about humanity as much as it was about music.
Completely. And it's such it has so many human elements to it, of course. I feel like Brian really makes himself very vulnerable, which was reflected upon quite a lot in the book. A lot of people are referencing that, the vulnerability that is there throughout, Brian Wilson Presents Smile, as well as the early stages of it in 66 and 67.
Well,
Um,
it's there from the very beginning, the lonely
Absolutely.
sea. I mean, this guy is there's a melancholy um, in his voice, in his heart, in his soul, in his songs that can only come from growing up in a household filled with, you know, we don't know how bad it was, but
Mm.
we know what a sensitive soul he is. So even if it's not as bad as has been described, it affected him dramatically and changed his abilities in life, not his ability to make music, but his ability to stand up for himself. That's what his upbringing cost him. His ability to say, no, it's going to be this way, it's my way or the highway, or okay, you guys don't want to do this, you Capital, I'm going to another label with this music. He could have done that had he had a stronger upbringing that would have given him self-confidence beyond his musical confidence.
So thankful for all the people that were a part of this journey and were surrounding him with that support and that love and that encouragement that he needed to be able to take that step. Because, as you've referenced just then, so much of that was kind of stripped away very early on in his creative career. So I think just kind of talking about you a little bit, David. I think there was a couple of times in the book where whether it was yourself or other people kind of acknowledging you and your contribution towards all of this, and just taking a second to highlight that and celebrate that and acknowledge the part that you played in all of this. And what does that mean to you, and what is your intention here? Like, what legacy do you want to leave, and how does it feel to know that you have played such a huge part in this journey of Brian Wilson Presents Smile?
Oh, now you're going to make me cry. Um, it's unbelievable.
Mm.
Um, this book, the last book from 2022, God only knows, which was a massive update, kind of like if you were reading my diary from the years since the Beach Boys and the California Myth, and this book, and who knows more books to come. I feel an obligation because of the place I've had and what I've seen and experienced to share as much as possible, not just with today's fans, but for Brian's legacy, so that when researchers are studying him 50, 100, 200 years from now, it's as much as possible is there. Um, as to as to as to my role, um, it, it's unbelievable, honestly.
Mm.
I teach a number of courses at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. And in my documentary class, I end the quarter by showing Beautiful Dreamer to the students. And I say to them, we've watched a lot of documentaries this quarter, and we've always talked about them beforehand and analyzed them in one way or another. This time we're going to watch a film, and then I'm going to tell you a story afterwards. So after they've watched Beautiful Dreamer, I then tell them a story. And I say to them, when I was sitting where you are, when I was 19, I became obsessed with Brian Wilson and Smile. And my roommate and we went down this rabbit hole. And one day my roommate said, "Well, if you're so upset about it, why don't you do something about it?" And that's when I came up with this crazy notion. I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile. Then I make a joke with the class. I said, had I known it was going to take 33 years, I'm not sure what I would have done. But the truth is that it's clear to me that this was some sort of calling, some sort of mission that I was on from the moment I read Tom Nolan's article in Rolling Stone and heard the song Surf's Up Until I Die on the Surf's Up album. It was something doesn't make sense here. And I had started college as a journalism major, but the instinct was still in me to be outraged at whatever was wrong. And so it was like an investigative journey. And if we talk about Brian's life as a jigsaw puzzle with 10 million pieces and Smile as a jigsaw puzzle with 1 million pieces, in this book, I've got a couple 100,000 pieces
Mm.
told by the people who lived it and experienced it in one way or another. As an oral history, the book is designed not for me to tell you what to think about Smile, but for all these other people to tell the story. And my conclusions haven't really changed since I wrote The Beach Boys and the California Myth back in 1978. My adult understanding has. So I was a kid when I wrote the book. I was 25. So now I'm, an elder statesman. I'm in my 70s. And so when I look back, I can understand why they were scared. They all had homes and wives and families. And what is this going to do to the Beach Boys as a business? What is this going to do to our careers? So I can understand that now in a way that I couldn't have, nearly a half century ago. And so hopefully this book uh, has um, more kindness to it. Uh, there's no one to blame. There's just life, and in certain ways, it almost feels like everything happened the way it had to happen
Mm.
for for Brian Wilson Presents Smile to be a Brian Wilson solo project. Because as beautifully as the Beach Boys sang on the original Smile sessions, there was something that wasn't working for Brian, for them, and all of the causes we know and don't know. And so for Brian to have this triumph with he and his band and his new family um, seems like a happy ending to a terribly sad story.
Agree more with that. And I really appreciate, first of all, for you just sitting for a moment to recognize the impact that you had on the project. I think we owe you a lot. And again, even creating this book, using rather than, like you said, you're not trying to tell us what to think. It's just a whole variety of amazing people sharing their stories and kind of putting that all together. And that tells the story itself.
Well, I wish that I could have done in-depth interviews about Smile with Carl and
Mhm.
Dennis. That didn't happen. One of the guiding lights, the North Star, if you will, of this book for me was I had to either be able to see the interview or hear the interview. I didn't do in-depth interviews about Smile with Carl and Dennis. Um, I was able to see Carl talk about Smile briefly in the Don Was documentary. Uh, Mike, Al, and Bruce spoke about Smile when the Beach Boys Smile Sessions box set came out, but that was all retrospectively. What were they thinking at the time? There's really very little of it. There's a couple of crazy quotes from Dennis. It's Smile is so good it makes Pet Sounds stink. Which this stuff gets taken out of context, and so I wish there could have been more Beach Boys. I worked with two researchers to get it as much Beach Boy into the book as was reasonable given the fact they had just done the Genesis book. And as I say, I wish there could have been more. I don't think that would have changed um, my ultimate feeling about it. What it would have done for the reader is go, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. So when Al tells the story of Brian driving him around the parking lot, 2 dozen times, you know, whether he was high on acid or whatever drug it was, um, does that story have a place? Yeah, but Al didn't tell it to me.
Mm.
It's elsewhere in the Beach Boys literature, and in terms of Mike, uh, he clearly talks about loving the music of Smile, and I think I've made that clear in the book. But his questions to Van Dyke and about Van Dyke's lyrics, um, he's been talking about that for since I've been reading about Smile. So what did that do to Brian that the questions were being asked? David Anderley said Brian needed 100% support.
Mm.
Van Dyke says um, Brian had earned the right for this experiment based on how much he had sold already. He had made everybody rich and famous, so he could do this experiment. Maybe there was residual fear from the release of Caroline No that he was going to go solo. There's a million what ifs, woulda, shoulda, couldas all over the place. That's why we will never know. And I think I use this analogy in the book of it being like looking at something through a kaleidoscope. And if you turn the kaleidoscope, a quarter inch, things look differently. And so
Mm.
it depends from whose point of view you're looking at it from. This story, I'm the one who chose the quotes that are here. So I am responsible for the telling of the story, but I didn't make up any quotes. And it's I have to rely on Danny Hutton, who arguably Brian's best friend in his entire adult life. A story that Chuck Negron tells in Three Dog Nightmare about Brian producing Redwood and what happened when the Beach Boys came to the sessions. It's heartbreaking. The story that Linda Ronstadt tells in her memoir that I took a piece of for this book of Brian showing up um, at her door with a handful of change and saying, "I don't have enough money to do the laundry. Do you have any? Can you lend me a quarter or whatever?" I guess I was in God only knows. I mean, there's been a series of guardian angels in Brian's life, uh, and I've tried to include them in the book. I don't think anybody has been more significant than Gloria Ramos, who has now been with Brian going on 40 years. She really looks after him in a way that none of us can. And I think Brian might be gone if not for her.
Yeah.
So there's so much story. Someone could take all the interviews that have been done elsewhere and cherry pick stuff from my book and write a completely different book if they chose to. This is how I chose to do it, and and I'm really proud of the book. I think from beginning with a quote from somebody who you wouldn't think has much to do with Smile to the chapters of fan reminiscences of seeing Smile to the anthology in the back of the book, essays of people who in one way or another are connected to Brian and Smile. I feel like I've tried to give voice inside this book, not just to me, but to everybody who could step forward to do that. And I'm not sure the exact percentage, but I think 75% of the book are the words of other people. Now, again, I'm responsible for what words are in the book, but an awful lot of them are not mine.
think that's truly amazing that you've given a voice to so many people, and so many people has have a story about Smile. Like you could ask pretty much anybody, well, what are your thoughts on Smile? Brian Wilson's present Smile, and they could talk for hours. I know I could, and it's just I think the fact that this is all in one nicely put together piece thanks to you is truly amazing, and having the opportunity to read that was so grounding because you resonate with so much and you're like, other people feel like me. I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one who's obsessed. You said that you're obsessed. There was one quote which may have been from you saying, Smile is our Bible. Like, what a statement to say. So I'm so fortunate that this book exists and those stories are out there, and those stories will continue to grow. There will just be more and more as time goes on.
Thank you. Yeah, I know and I did 25 new interviews for the book,
Oh, wow.
including all of the living members of Brian's band. But I also talked to the man who ran the Royal Festival Hall as to how this all happened. I
Yeah.
talked to Brian's music agent. I talked to the audio engineer. There were still lots of people to speak with. I was going back and forth with Jeffrey Foskett to do an interview. And the day it was scheduled, he emailed me and said, I'm sorry, David, I have no voice today. And I wasn't smart enough to say, Jeff, just email me a couple of sentences of how you feel looking back on it 20 years from now. Fortunately, I had great interviews with everybody from before the world premiere, including Van Dyke Parks. So there was an awful lot of material to put forward that had never been read before, never been seen before. I mean, I love hearing, when you make a documentary, you do the interviews, you pick what are called selects, and our first version was like 6 hours. You got to cut it down to under 2 hours. So a lot of wonderful stuff gets lost, and you accept that. You don't think about it, and then 20 years later to go look at those interviews, and it's like, oh my God, I forgot Brian telling the story of how David Crosby used to come up to his house to listen to what he was doing because David Crosby wanted to know what was coming next. That Van Dyke and Jerry Parks were taken to Brian's house by David Crosby because, hey, you guys have got to hear this. I mean, there are so many pieces, as I say, to this puzzle that we just took it for granted. Oh yeah, Brian met Van Dyke Parks talking on the lawn at Terry Melcher's house, and then he asked him to write "Smile" with him. I mean, it's like this teeny little moment,
Yeah.
and but there's so much to every moment, and I wish there could be more about every song, but I'm not a song by song person. I'm not a musical
Mhm.
analyst. Each song means something to everybody else. And I don't know if you noticed this or not, but um, the two songs that sent me on the journey were Till I Die and Surf's Up.
Mm.
And in the last essay of the anthology, the two songs that saved the essayist's life are Till I Die and Surf's Up.
Mm.
And that to me was, well, how full circle can it come?
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. Like full circle. Because I think it's just this is a story, like I said, is that's going to continue to keep on growing, and the stories that have been shared are just remarkable, and it's so amazing to know that there's just a community out there that feels as passionate as we all do, and I could talk to you all day about this, and now that I've just brought up community has reminded me that I am here to also ask you some questions from the Reddit community. So if
Okay.
you would allow me a little bit of time to ask those to you, I know that the people who submitted these would be more than thankful. And these are all people, I don't know them personally, but I feel like I know them because they love the Beach Boys and Brian and the whole story as much as we all do. So I'm really thankful that I'm able to, deliver these questions to you. So I do have
Okay.
them down. So forgive me if I'm looking down. I just want to make sure I capture the essence of what these people are trying to ask you. So I guess I'll go with the first question now, which is one I actually had myself, but I thought I'm not going to ask it because this is one that comes up a lot. So I'll let This person here take the floor. So their screen name is Round Rectangles, and they want to know about the rite of passage of Beach Boys fans to come up with their own renditions of Smile, their own playlists or remix or tracking of the songs. So how do you view this aspect of Smile and its impact on the album's legacy and potentially a bigger question, the music industry as a whole? Very big question there. But yeah, I guess just the playlist that fans like myself and others would make of Smile.
Well, there's a section in the book that talks about the DIY nature of Smile,
Yeah.
do it yourself, because for years there was no disc called Smile that you could put on a turntable. There was no cassette. There was no way to play Smile. So fans took it into their own hands. Um, Interestingly enough, the man who runs president of None Such Records that released Brian Wilson Presents Smile, he was one of those fans too. And I don't think one can overestimate how important it was that fans were doing that and can still do that now with the Beach Boys Smile sessions. Um, I don't think I think it's wonderful, no pun intended. Um, the music, uh, as David Anderley tells the story that Brian would come home from the studio with acetates and say, "This is going to be part of Cabin Essence," and they would go, "Oh, no, Brian, that was great when it was part of Wonderful." And then they would listen to it and they'd go, "Oh, you're right. It's oh my God, it's better." So if Brian was doing that,
Mm.
it makes sense that now that the pieces are out in the world, that the fans can do it. Now, long before the pieces were out in the world, when there was just a handful of actual official releases and a whole bunch of stuff on bootleg, I think that's what kept, in a sense, a Brian Wilson community together. And I think the combination of the do-it-yourself tapes and Dominic Priore's uh, classic book, Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, where so one could read about the contemporaneous articles from back in the day about Smile. So one could get a sense, oh, this is what people were expecting. And then you could, with a couple of cassette decks or however you did it, make your own version of Smile. I think that was great. It wasn't anything I ever did because I just would listen to the music. I wasn't trying to figure out a sequence. That that never mattered to me which song I heard first. Um, I think like a lot of people, I felt like Surf's Up had to be last. As David Anderley says in the book, he never thought Good Vibrations was part of Smile at all. He just thought it was the step from Pet Sounds to Smile. So, as record companies do, they insist on including your big hit record on your next album. So I see a Smile Slick sitting behind you that I think it's the second version of the Slick because I think there was an album cover Slick that didn't include Good Vibrations. If I have my collector's memory uh,
You'd be right.
intact. That's good. Um, but I think it was wonderful when it started. Um, Brian and I met with Capitol Records in 1995 after the success of the Good Vibrations box set with a 5-year plan to reissue 30th anniversary packages of Beach Boys music. Each 6-month period, there would be a new package. So the first one would be May 1996, the Pet Sound Sessions. Then in the fall of 1966, there would be a 2 CD Good Vibrations sessions. Then the following spring would be the Smile sessions, and on and on and on. So once he understood with the success of the Good Vibrations box, how much people loved hearing this stuff, that bonus discs 5, um, that he was all into it. He wanted to get the music out. There was a whole story as to why that fell apart, but um, I think it's great. I think the fans keeping the flame alive was important. And as Melinda, the late Melinda Wilson said to Brian in late 2003, early 2004, hey Brian, the fans on the message board, they're asking, what about Smile? They're saying, what about doing Smile? The Royal Festival Hall was saying, how do we follow 4 successful nights of Brian and his band performing Pet Sounds? Well, the only logical thing is Smile. And so they commissioned it. So there's so many, as I said, pieces to the puzzle of trying to figure out how this all happened. And I liken it, I appreciate your acknowledging my role in it. There's so many people who
Mm,
had a part. And I don't know if you ever played dominoes when you were a kid. Do you know what they
definitely did.
are?
Oh yeah, of
Okay.
course, of course.
Okay. So you'd set up a row of dominoes in whatever pattern, and you would knock them over and you would watch. But if you took out any couple of dominoes, it would stop. It wouldn't get all the way to completion. And I think that's what we're looking at with Brian Wilson Presents Smile. If the fan community isn't doing the DIY, if the bootlegs aren't being made, if the Good Vibrations box set doesn't happen and get such a strong reaction, if Brian doesn't start touring again, if he doesn't do full albums like Pet Sounds, nothing can happen like Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So there's just so many steps along the way, so many dominoes that were not ruined, that came into existence because of the passion of everybody involved.
Think this answers the question perfectly and moves on quite nicely to the next question that we have from another user, which kind of tacks on to what you've just said. So this user, their name is Vim Vinyl, and they're from not the Beach Boys Reddit, but the Lemon Twigs Reddit, which they kind of intertwine, Beach Boys, Lemon Twigs,
They
you know.
sure do.
But their question is also reflecting on how Smile is such an album that's just been mixed and evolved, and it's just a legendary album. So they want to know, do you think that the original Smile, if it had been released, would have had such a unique place in rock history, and were the fans ready for it?
Well, let's take these in pieces. First of
Yes.
all, Vim, I went to see the Lemon Twigs in December here in Los Angeles with Darian Sahanajan, Robin Gregory, and they're incredible,
Mm.
as you already know because you're on the Lemon Twigs Reddit. Uh, it's not an accident that the older brother, Brian Paul, is named after Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney. It's not an accident. I mean, I was uh, stunned when he told me he had read The Beach Boys and the California Myth when he was like 9 years old.
Wow.
Um, they are so melodic. They have so many hooks in their songs. They sing so beautifully that it's stunning how great they are, which is
Mm.
why they get a mention in the epilogue because they are clearly carrying forth this legacy of popular music that is melodic and filled with harmony. So God bless them. And um, Brian's got a new solo album out, which you can hear. And I'm looking forward to the next Lemon Twigs album and hope to see them again. It was the first concert I'd been to since the outbreak of COVID.
Wow, a good first concert to get back into
Good.
it.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Not a great venue, but great concert. Um, the oh now I've already forgotten the other questions.
So the question was, if the original
Oh,
Smile had
if
released,
Smile had
yeah.
come out and so so we have to take it in two different
Hmm.
sections. In England, they were desperately waiting for Smile because of the publicity that Derek Taylor had generated. As he called Heroes and Villains the most famous unreleased single, or the most famous single no one's yet to hear.
Yeah.
So England had embraced Pet Sounds. They were embracing all sorts of new music like the Pink Floyd and I mean, you name it. England would have embraced Smile. whether it came before or after Sergeant Pepper, they would have embraced it. The question might be if it had come out before Sergeant Pepper, what would the Beatles have done? Would they have said, maybe we need to do something different with a couple of the tracks on Sergeant Pepper? I mean, who knows? Would they have taken it back? That's one of those woulda, shoulda, coulda questions. In America, the question is, how would the audience have embraced it here? So there was finally in America in 1967, there was a growing rock press like Crawdaddy. And Paul Williams, may he rest in peace, was in love with Smile. I mean, he and David Anderle have a whole book filled with their conversations about Smile, um, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to hear about it and to theorize about it in the, again, contemporaneous,
Mm.
because things changed so much over the years as to what people had to say. Um, so what would the American public have done in 67 with Smile? Well, I would guess that the same people who bought Pet Sounds would have bought Smile.
Mm.
That a lot of the people who bought Good Vibrations would have said, an entire album filled with music created in the same modular style that Good Vibrations was. I've got to check that out. There was growing drug use in the baby boom
Mm.
generation, and Smile would have probably been a good album to listen to stoned. I wouldn't know. I'm not a stoner.
Me either.
Um, um, the the question that I think was raised at the time was A, Capitol Records, and B, the Beach Boys touring group. What are we going to do with this music? Well, the Beach Boys touring group, all they had to do was add Heroes and Villains to the lineup as the latest single. So the latest single that we heard, the Heroes and Villains single, was not Brian's original conception of Heroes and Villains. So if the original Heroes and Villains had been done, then it might have been a different story. Uh, it may have never gotten on AM radio as a 1 and 2 part piece that was 7 minutes long. It may have only been played on FM as like, you know, this is really cool. There's just no answers to it. But what we can say by not finishing Smile, by shelving it, that uh, it almost overnight made the Beach Boys irrelevant to the music listening and record buying audience. Now, again, there was the touring group and the studio group, and that this is the big split. Um, Brian wanted his work to be done the way he wanted to be done, and when it wasn't, when he shelved it, and no one else made that decision, Brian Wilson made the decision to shelve it. We were deprived of what it could have been. Now, one can listen, in my opinion, if all one did was listen to what's on the Good Vibrations box set, and add a few things, you've got an album's worth of music, and that would have been incredible in 67. Would it have been better than Pepper, more impactful than Pepper? I don't think so. I just think it would have been the Beach Boys' next step. And then who knows what Brian would have done next. But to me, what was snuffed out in 67 with him shelving Smile and then the Redwood fiasco was the end of his ambition. And rather than let's make each album better than the next album, as he had said in 67, our next album was going to be, as advanced from Pet Sounds as Pet Sounds was from Summer Days and Summer Nights. Well, there were going to be no more pronouncements like that. And Smiley Smile, to use the too oft quoted Carl Wilson line, Smiley Smile is a bunt instead of a grand slam.
Mm.
Well, if Carl Wilson, who heard it all, is saying that, who are we to argue? Um, so once we heard Cabin Essence and Surf's Up and Our Prayer on those the songs that were released, well, it was obvious that something was amiss. Um, Wild Honey was kind of a back to basics record, not an ambitious record, just kind of okay, here's a band performing a dozen new Brian Wilson compositions, or almost a dozen,
Mm.
uh, and having fun. Friends was, as somebody said it, a few years later, an album for Brian to cool out by, whatever that meant. But in the meantime, there's a song called Diamond Head on there that could have fit on Smile.
Oh yeah.
There's also Busy Doing Nothing, which is Brian telling you exactly what's going on in his life at this moment. Busy doing nothing. That's not the guy who's going to make a great album.
Mm.
And that 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 fiercely that, that fiercely competitive spirit was gone. It's not that he wouldn't be competitive again and go into the studio and have ideas and realize them and they'd be great like This Whole World, but he wasn't going to do it on a 4 album, 3 album, 2 album, or even 1 album a year basis. It just wasn't ever going to happen again with the Beach Boys. And so there's multiple tragedies tied into this. How influential it would have been on the world of music. I have no question it would have been influential on the world of music, because everybody was listening to what Brian was doing, especially musicians. They were just knocked out by what he was doing. They couldn't believe how great what he was doing was. So they would have wanted to be part of it.
Mm.
What's this guy? I mean, same way a decade later, Lindsey Buckingham is making Tusk for Fleetwood Mac, and one day he told me, much to my shock, "Oh yeah, David, when I was making Tusk, I had your book in the studio and I kept reading the chapters on Smile. So what happened to
Um,
Brian didn't happen to me." So he understood it as an artistic tragedy, which is how the Beach Boys and the California Myth was written. And both God Only Knows and the new book, Smile, The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection, are are human triumphs and artistic triumphs.
Beautifully put. That was a great way to answer that question. I'm sure that Vim Vinyl is going to be very happy with that answer, as everyone else who is listening to this. So
I hope so.
oh, absolutely. So I've got about 2 to 3 more questions. So the next question we have is from Dio California from the Beach Boys subreddit, and they so kindly helped to facilitate this interview today. So big thank you to them. So their question is about specifically the later period. So Beautiful Dreamer and Brian Wilson present Smile, and recognizing that through these two things coming out and being released, a whole new generation was being introduced to Brian and the music of the Beach Boys and just a whole new world musically. So his question in regard to that is, where do you see the story of Brian and the boys today without Brian's Smile and without Beautiful Dreamer providing a gateway to it? And how would that have potentially impacted Brian's reputation?
You mean if they had gone just from Good Vibrations to Wild Honey?
Yeah.
I um I think you used the word cultural impact earlier.
Mm.
Um, the Beach Boys' impact was musical on the industry and cultural on people who didn't know what a surfboard was, who lived, as far from the ocean as imaginable, all the way to England, where yes, there was an ocean, but there was no surfing today. Um, the that endless summer impact was there, but in terms of them being an important creative entity, without Smile, without the myth of Smile, without them having pieces of Smile to include, I don't know that the fan base would have, like me, would have been sticking around waiting for the next album, hoping we were going to get a great Beach Boys album, hoping each time. And one from 74 on, always being disappointed, with ironically the exception of That's Why God Made the Radio, which I think was as good a reunion album as one could have ever dreamed of. Uh, but the cultural impact, and I think Mike recognized this very well in 74 when Endless Summer came out, that there was this body of music that they created prior to Smile, that's what made people happy and that's what made people come to the concerts. Um, Concerts have gone from that point, concerts went up to stadiums,
Mm.
all sorts of gigantic venues, down to a couple of thousand seaters nowadays. And except in certain places like England and New York, where their fan base just remains gigantic. And goodness gracious, they played the Royal Albert Hall not long ago, and they played Jones Beach Amphitheater, which seats, I don't know, 5,000 to 6,000 people. So people love the fun in the sun, girls on the beach,
Yeah.
surfer girl. I get around Beach Boys. But that cultural impact was gone by 67. And they didn't do anything after 66 to create something new. Everything was in the style of the previous impact, with the exception of the Surf's Up, I think with the exception of the Surf's Up and Holland albums. The Sunflower album was arguably the greatest group album ever made.
Mm.
But it wasn't about anything. It was about the joy of music, which is important, but nobody was listening. And who knows what would have happened if that had been really successful. We wouldn't have gotten the Surf's Up album. They would have tried to replicate the success of Sunflower.
Yeah.
So everything has a cause and effect, but but essentially the Beach Boys became the first group to be an oldies group.
Mm.
They've been doing, Mike's been doing it with Bruce now since 1974.
Believable.
I mean, Bruce had left for a while but came back. Bruce is now, his second trip with the group is now, I think, 46 years old. So I mean, it's remarkable how
Yeah.
long they've kept it going. Um, that part of the group is, I love those hits. And in the 70s, and in 1967, my first concert was a Beach Boys concert, them playing 25 minutes of the hits. And then in the 70s, I went to see them, I don't know, a dozen, 15, 20 times. I'd have to get out my ticket stub collection and count them all. But at some point, it felt tired and old, and the new material felt weak. And so I stopped going. Um, and so each new generation, fortunately, is introduced to the classic hits. Um, Somebody out there, please tell me how many greatest hits albums Capitol has put out since Best of the Beach Boys, which wasn't even a great selection necessarily. But I'd love to know because it feels like 75 or 100. Whereas, the the Beatles have put out the Beatles One, which has sold 32 million copies.
Yeah.
And if you added up collection of if you added up the total of all the Beach Boys greatest hits albums, it might not be 32 million, but it would be in the tens of millions. And I think that's what's been disappointing is they've just been treated uh, disrespectfully.
Yeah.
And if you want to know why, it largely it's because they did not have management, um, with the exception of James William Guercio, who was unable to kind of wrestle it all together, but in a large was largely, I think, responsible for Dennis and Carl's solo albums coming out. But managing the Beach Boys was an impossible task, whether it was Murray Wilson or whomever. And whereas the Beatles had themselves, with the headmaster being Brian Epstein, outside the studio, and inside the studio, Sir George Martin. So they had terrific guidance, and the Beatles are I hate to use the word, but as a brand, they're extraordinarily well managed. And since Iconic took over the Beach Boys, there's been the Beach Boys tribute show and the new Disney Plus documentary, and uh, there've been a box set. I don't know how responsible they are for that, but I think there'll be another box set coming, and 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 that all plays to the hardcore fan.
Yeah.
Uh, what what would get a new generation of Beach Boys fans is hard to grasp. I mean, I have kids. I mean, I'm teaching a course on the Beach Boys at UCLA, and I'm teaching in my Beatles class on the first day of, of of the quarter. The student raised his hand during the Q&A and said, are we going to be talking about the rivalry between Brian Wilson and the Beatles?" And I said, "Well, actually, that wasn't going to be part of the class, but now that you bring it up, we'll talk about it." Um, with the Beach Boys, it's a much more difficult and unhappy story. I mean, it's filled with tragedy. It's filled with early death. It's filled with intra-group squabbles, and it's there's kind of no story worth telling, um, to me, after Holland.
Mm.
It's all been disappointments. And yes, the Beach Boys Love You is a cool and quirky album. Okay, but is cool and quirky going to get you an audience? Well, yes, it gets you a cult audience. So
Yeah.
that's what they've become. They've become a cult audience, the same way Brian's audience is a. If you think of the Beach Boys audience as a pie, he's got a slice of that pie. And then thanks to the DIY people and thanks to Dominic Priori's work and others, there's a whole group of people who care about Smile who don't care about the Beach Boys at all.
Yeah.
And and
True.
and I really hope that people will pick up this book who know nothing about the Beach Boys and know nothing about Smile and get become obsessives, because Smile as a work of art is so it's unclassifiable, and it's not rock music, it's not pop music, it's not classical music. It's just something unique unto its own, done, at first by a 24-year-old kid and ultimately finished by a 62-year-old man. And again, it's the triumph of this human spirit, the courage it took for him to do it. That story alone is worth reading. And if you love music, I can't imagine if you don't know about Smile, yes, go listen to this Smile music. I mean, there are two times in the book where I actually say, and if you haven't listened to the Beach Boys Smile sessions lately or never, listen to tracks 1 through 19 on disc one. On disc one. I mean, it's like I'm trying to get people who don't even know Smile to love Smile, not just our cult, if you will.
Yeah, I fully appreciate that. And I think there'll be many more fans to come. And I like how you said about people just being able to pick up this book and just get something out of it, just being able to get the full story, because I can fully appreciate that. Even though I know the story, it was like such a perfect, portrayal of it, I think, with so many different voices in the mix. So,
And there's even a chapter at the very beginning called "Smile in a Nutshell." It's just a couple
yeah,
of pages. So I'm hoping somebody like picks the book up and they start smiling nutshell and they read those 2 pages and they
Oh.
go, wow, maybe this is something I want to know more about.
Well, I think I have the last question I have. It's probably a bit of a loaded question, so I'll leave it with you on how you want to answer this. But this
Okay.
question is from the Laughing Gravy, and without giving too much away, what information is included in the book that hasn't been known or released before? Now, you can't give us too much because obviously we want people to buy the book, but maybe just a little taste to get us all excited, more excited, I should say.
Well, I think Mr. Gravy, um, I don't know that it's details. I shouldn't say I don't know that it's information so much as it's a giant canvas of details that are painted in 2003, 2004 by Brian's band as their experience, as they're experiencing it being put back together, as they're reconstructing it. The depth of the quotes, because remember when you make a documentary, people get to talk for a sentence or two. So Van Dyke Parks in this book gets to talk when he talks, it's for a paragraph or two or three. And you get a sense of how smart he is, how the wordplay that's always at work, not just when he's writing lyrics, but just as he speaks about things. When he talks about just the experience of the first time he goes to Brian's house and hears the work in progress of Sloop John B, and he's there for an hour and a half. When he describes how he felt when he left that night, it's not, oh boy, that was an incredible night. It's just you got to get as I say, you have to have a dictionary handy when he's talking because he's just so uh, full of information you want
Yeah,
to understand completely. And I really believe you can't get all of this in 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 me giving you a couple of details. What details are there that are in this book? Well, here's Tom Nolan in the anthology, and I think a lot of the anthology essays are full of things we wouldn't otherwise know. But here's one, Mr. Gravy. Um, um, and I don't think this story has been told anywhere, but Tom tells a story about Brian putting a loudspeaker on the hood of his car, and this is near the Hawthorne house. And when he thought his parents were in the bedroom um, being intimate, he gets on the loudspeaker as if he's the police, and it's like, "Okay, we know what you're doing in there. Come on out." Um, those kinds of there's so many stories about Brian that you'll hear in this book that you haven't heard. I don't think it's I don't think it's facts. I think it's an understanding of how things happened more, more. Facts, go to 10452 Bellagio. That website has all the facts in the world, all the known facts that there are. And Andrew Doe was very helpful with the research on this book. But I think it's just the depth of the storytelling. And Nelson Bragg said this. I don't know if you have this in Australia, Jenny, but here in the States, when we used to get assigned books in school and
mm,
you didn't want to read them, there were these things called Cliff Notes
mm,
that you could buy maybe for a quarter, and it would have all of the key bits of information you needed to know to write the essay the teacher was going to sign. So instead of
amazing.
reading the book, you would read the Cliff Notes.
Yeah.
And Nelson Bragg said after reading the book, he said, "Beautiful Dreamer was like reading the Cliff Notes version of this book." Um, and he then said, it answers all the questions you had about Smile and questions you didn't even know to ask, which is a wonderful thing for him to say. But it's kind of not true. There are people who have questions that are unanswerable. You can ask them, but Van Dyke's not going to tell you the answer to some of those questions because A, he doesn't want to talk about it, and B, he probably doesn't remember. And so a lot of this is going to remain a mystery. And 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 I'm sorry, Laughing Gravy. I don't have a pile of details to outline for you today, but I think this book, Brian talked about in a 65 interview, he talked about going to the piano and playing feels. That's how he wrote music. You hear him when he tells the story about after his first acid trip, how he went to the piano and played what he played that became California Girls. This book is about feels at every step of the process, at every step of the story. It's how the people who were there felt about what was going on. And I think that's the best way I can uh, describe it.
That
Sorry, not to be more specific, but I don't have a list of details. If you ask me a question, obviously I don't shut up, but but details is I shouldn't say it's not my strength, but it's not it's the book is filled with details
it
because
is.
it's coming from the people who were there. So I'm sorry, you're going to have to read it. Ebook will
Oh,
be out in a few days.
exactly. And I fully appreciate you not having that stack there just to refer to. And also we need to buy the book. We want to buy the book. So we can't give it all away. But yeah, David, this has been an amazing conversation. And I hope everyone who's listened to this or is going to listen to this get something out of it and are encouraged to go and buy the book. I've read it. It's amazing. Please go out and buy it. Go and follow David on all his socials. He's out there. He's showing off, doing his thing, and we're just so thankful that you've put this out and that you've given me the time today to speak to you about it. So, any last words, David?
Sure, a couple of things. I'm going to be doing the AMA Reddit after everyone's had a chance to read the book. But at my Facebook page, we're 20 days into the 30 days of Brian Wilson and Smile in advance of the book, and posting all sorts of interesting and obscure links of Brian Wilson's stuff that we think are relevant to the book. So if you want to see what happened, there's lots of cool videos posted and some great commentary from people as well.
That's wonderful, David. And I follow you over on Facebook, but I'll be sure that everyone that's listening will take the opportunity to do that as well. And again, please go and buy the book.
I'm sorry. There's also a page called Smile, the Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian
Perfect.
Wilson that a fan has started about the book, posting all these things, a lot of which I'm sharing on almost every day. I share it on my page as well
Wonderful.
with some commentary. So either one of those Facebook sites um, has a lot of Brian Wilson stuff,
That's wonderful.
as does Brian's page.
Yep. Yeah, there's a wealth of information out there if we know where to find it, and you've given us lots of good tips there of where to go. And again, I'll say it till I lose my breath. Buy the book. Buy the book, read the book, love the book, talk about the book, tell your friends about the book. It's a great book.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much,
David.
Jenny.
Thank you so much.